1863, China. The height of the Taiping Rebellion, one of the bloodiest wars in human history. The rebels lining the city walls looked defiantly at the small army facing them. Small those attackers may be, but Western drilled and armed, they carry a name that strikes fear into their enemies. The ever victorious army. And at their head is an English officer who has notched up 13 successive victories. Through a hail of arrows, musket balls and other missiles, he leads his men forward, armed with nothing more than a wooden cane. Has he a death wish? Maybe. Is he brave? Undoubtedly. His name is Charles Gordon. Chinese Gordon, the British newspapers call him. But the question that nobody seems to ask is, how did this British officer ever end up commanding a Chinese army in the first place? Our story unfolds during the Taiping Rebellion, one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history, which raged from 1850 through to 1864. And during that rising, 20 to 30 million people died. To put that into context, the US Civil War, fought roughly the same time, saw 750,000 killed. The rebellion was led by a man who claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ. Based out of Nanjing, which he called Taiping, the movement was a quasi-Christian theocracy which banned opium, alcohol, tobacco, gambling, foot binding and prostitution. It preached a form of social equality and common landholding. Soon the Taiping controlled the lower and middle Yangtze Valley, the richest, most populous, most cultivated heartland of China. As pseudo-Christians, they were not opposed to Westerners in a way that the later Boxer Rising was. Indeed, they hoped that the Western powers would support them, and initially those powers, not least the missionary societies, were intrigued by them. But while this civil war was raging, Britain and France were fighting their own war with China. The Second Opium War, also known as the Arrow War, was in many respects the unfinished business from both sides from the First Opium War in the 1840s. That conflict had resulted in the British gaining control of Hong Kong, and the Chinese being forced to open certain ports, such as Shanghai, to foreign merchants. In 1856, a dispute over a ship named the Arrow in Canton spiralled out of control, and in 1860, 11,000 British and Indian troops, along with 6,000 French, were landed in the north and advanced on the capital, Beijing. The British Army, commanded by General Sir James Hope Grant, included 27-year-old Garnet Wolseley, and, born in the same year, a Royal Engineer officer, Charles Gordon. Arriving in late September 1860, Gordon was too late for the fighting, but did join in the entry into the capital and the looting and burning by French as well as British troops of the Summer Palace the following month. The destruction of the ornate palace, more a huge estate than a simple palace, was ordered by the senior diplomat accompanying the expedition, Lord Elgin, in response to the torture and execution of British prisoners. In a letter to his family, written on the 25th of October, Gordon described the destruction of the Summer Palace. "We accordingly went out and, after pillaging it, burned the whole palace, destroying in a vandal-like manner most valuable property which could not be replaced for 4 millions. You can scarcely imagine the beauty and magnificence of the palaces we burnt. It made one's heart sore to burn them." Whilst lamenting the destruction of the palace, in another letter he wrote that everyone was wild for plunder, and that with his share of that prize money, "I have done well." Those dual thoughts give us an insight into the mind of this complicated Victorian hero. Promoted to brevet or temporary major at the end of the year, he stayed on in China and by 1862 had been posted to Shanghai. Situated at the mouth of the Yangtze, the city was close to the centre of the ongoing Taiping Rebellion. With their pseudo-Christian, social reform, anti-Beijing agenda, you might think that the Taiping would be natural allies for the Western powers. But you'd be wrong. By now, the movement was seen as most certainly a crank version of Christianity, even a heresy, and the brutality of their rule was obvious for all to see. Moreover, the Western governments now had a peace with Beijing. They had forced the imperial government to sign a treaty very favourable to foreigners, not so favourable to the Chinese, opening the country up to even more trade. To gain the benefits of that treaty, the British, French and others needed a stable government in China, and the Taiping threatened that stability, especially as, despite a promise not to, they were advancing down the Yangtze towards those commercial interests in Shanghai. The British sent troops to Shanghai under General Charles Staveley to protect their interests. Previously the colonel of the 44th Regiment of Foot and a veteran of the Crimean War, he had participated in the capture of Beijing in 1860. In 1862, he took to the field against the advancing rebels with a force of about 2,000 men, consisting of British Redcoats, Royal Navy sailors, Royal Marines, and a contingent provided by the French. Also in his force was Royal Engineer Charles Gordon. In the ensuing months, the Taiping were forced back about 30 miles from the city. There was another unit fighting alongside him. 2 years previously, merchants in Shanghai, nervous about the Taiping, had established their own Shanghai Foreign Rifles, a mercenary force of Europeans and Filipinos, under the command of American Frederick Townsend Ward. Drilled and armed to model a Western army, it was soon admitting Chinese to its ranks, and after a series of victories, it was honoured by the imperial government in Beijing with the name Ever Victorious Army in 1862. Later that year, Ward was mortally wounded, and when his successor, another American, assaulted the banker who was financing the force, and then defected to the Taiping, the local imperial governor, Li Hangshong, stepped in to fund the operation and asked General Staveley to provide a British officer to command the EVA. Staveley had just the man in mind. Yes, you've guessed it, Major Charles Gordon. Gordon had distinguished himself during Staveley's campaign against the Taiping in 1862. On one occasion, he had conducted a daring reconnaissance, crawling to within 100 yards of the enemy to sketch their defences. During the campaign, he'd shown coolness, competence, and critically, could work harmoniously with the Chinese, the precise qualities that his immediate predecessor as commander of the ever-victorious army definitely lacked. But why choose a Royal Engineer rather than an infantry officer? Well, Staveley recognised that with the Taiping controlling numerous cities, this war was a siege war and needed an officer with engineering skills to lead it. It also helped that he had mapped a large part of the region the previous summer, so Gordon was acquainted with the ground. And finally, there was a family link. Staveley's sister was married to Charles Gordon's eldest brother, Sir Henry Gordon, 15 years his senior. Now, before you think this is nepotism at work, I should point out that the headstrong and morally upright Charles Gordon actually threatened to turn down his appointment precisely because he feared that accusation. Nevertheless, he accepted and took command of the ever-victorious army in March 1863. He was 30 years old. The fourth son of Major General Henry William Gordon, a Royal Artillery officer, he had been born at Woolwich on the 28th of January 1833. With 4 generations of officers in the Gordon family, there really was only ever one career path for young Charles. He duly trained at the Royal Military Academy, Woolwich, and was commissioned into the Royal Engineers in 1852, on the eve of the Crimean War. During that war, he served at the Siege of Sevastopol in 1855, where he was noticed for his cool reconnaissance work under fire. Afterwards, he was a member of the Boundary Commission, fixing the new frontier between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, before returning to garrison duties back home. In 1860, he sailed for China to join the Second Opium War. A small, lean, wiry man, with crisp curly brown hair, his tailors claimed that he was 5 foot 9 inches, but as he carried his head thrown slightly forward, like a stoop, he looked shorter than he was. But it was his eyes that people remembered. Blue-grey in colour, they were, as one admirer called them, magical. More than one person said that they could almost read right through you. Another officer who met him in China described how his eyes had, quote, a fearless look in them. This was the man who would become Chinese Gordon, and later on, Gordon of Khartoum. The Chinese government paid Gordon £1,200 a year for taking command of the EVA, a heck of a lot more than a major was paid in the Royal Engineers at that time. But in a move that would become synonymous of the man and at odds with many Britons in Victoria's empire, he eschewed the financial reward, spending the bulk of it on medicine and comforts for his sick and wounded troops. A biographer later claimed that he left China as poor as when he had arrived. The arrival of Gordon galvanised the ever-victorious army. Whilst carrying that title of Army, Gordon's command was just over 3,000 men. However, drilled and armed to European standards, the first Chinese army to be thus organised, and benefiting from siege artillery and, crucially, a flotilla of armed paddle steamers, they were more than a match for their numerically superior enemy. Within days, the energetic Charles Gordon was leading his men to relieve the Chinese government garrison at Changzhou or Fushan. It was a straightforward campaign, but despite the ease of their victory, mainly thanks to limited opposition, he was able to both establish his credentials and also re-establish a level of confidence amongst his men that had taken a battering in the preceding months. Their next action was altogether harder. At the beginning of May 1863, his 3,000-strong army tried to capture a city defended by 10,000 Taiping. Over 2 days, Gordon's troops launched 3 ferocious attacks on the garrison before the town finally fell. The success came at a price, with 20 of his men plus a European officer killed and 142 wounded. It was at this battle that Gordon first led his men from the front, carrying his rattan cane. Thereafter, he would go into action armed with his cane, known as his Wand of Victory, creating both an aura of fearlessness and invincibility. At the end of the month, Gordon was to deliver his masterpiece at Qingshan, known to 19th century Europeans as Kunshan. Rather than storm the walls, as the Chinese imperial commander wanted him to do, Gordon used the steamer, Hyson, with a 32-pounder on the bow and a regiment of 350 of his men on board, to sail up the canal, smash the stake barriers and cut the Taiping line of retreat. The garrison now panicked and fled into the open, where large numbers were killed, drowned or captured. Gordon's losses were negligible. Qingshan now became his headquarters, as it sat at the centre of a canal network that would enable his steamers to drive deeper and deeper into Taiping-held territory. You have to admit that it had been a hectic and highly successful honeymoon period in charge of the ever-victorious army. But that was all about to come to a dramatic halt, and not because of the Taiping. Since taking over command, Gordon had been bolstering the EVA with captured Taiping fighters, and introducing a discipline hitherto lacking by bringing in British NCOs, donated by General Staveley, neither of which was welcomed by the veteran members of his army. But it was his decision to move his headquarters from Shanghai to the newly liberated Qingshan that was the straw that broke the camel's back. His men enjoyed living near their families and, shall we say, the high life of the camp followers in Shanghai. Moreover, many of his Chinese NCOs had also established various money-making sidelines there. An anonymous notice suddenly appeared on a wall, objecting to the move, and indeed the tightening of both discipline and the bounty arrangements, which Gordon had also ordered at the same time. Gordon now paraded the ever-victorious army, had one of its ringleaders, a corporal, shot by his bodyguard, and dismissed all the other malcontents. It was an example of that iron will that he would also display later in Sudan. Now, whilst it showed a no-nonsense determination and showed who was in charge, the mutiny had seriously weakened the EVA as a fighting force. In the days both before and after that execution of the ringleader, up to 2,000 men, half his force, had deserted and cleared off back to Shanghai. Undeterred, Gordon replaced them with new recruits, mainly Taiping defectors, and was back in action just 2 months later, taking 2 more rebel-held towns at the end of July 1863. Working alongside Lai Chongshang, the provincial governor, the British officer and his EVA steadily started squeezing out the Taiping out of the Yangtze Delta and would, inside the year, contribute to the eventual crushing of the rebellion. On the 12th of October, once more using the steamship Hyson, 1,000 of his men routed a force of nearly 20,000 Taiping at Wukong. They then moved on with the imperial forces under Lai Chongshang to besiege the city of Suzhou. Having successfully taken the stockades around the perimeter, the ever-victorious army prepared to assault the walls of the city itself. It was now that Gordon's run of 13 straight victories at the head of the EVA finally came to an end. On the night of the 27th-28th of November, his attack on the East Gate was repulsed at the cost of 165 men killed and wounded. Inside Suzhou, however, the Taiping command was split. The senior general who wanted to fight on was murdered by his subordinates at a banquet in early December. Gordon then brokered terms with them that guaranteed their lives if they surrendered. With that agreement in place, they duly surrendered the city. However, there was one slight problem. The imperial commander, Lai, didn't care what agreement the English commander of the ever-victorious army had struck. When his troops entered the city, they executed the 8 turncoat commanders along with up to 10,000 of their men. Furious that his word had been ignored, Gordon now refused an award from the imperial government of 10,000 silver taels, the equivalent of 3 years of his salary. That stubborn, high moral ground stance would also reappear in Sudan. In a huff, Gordon sat inactive at his headquarters until February 1864, when, half over, he went back on the offensive, taking Yixing and then accepting the surrender of the garrison at Liang. Finally in the march, after constantly leading the ever-victorious army from the front armed with just his rattan cane, his luck ran out. Gordon took a bullet below the knee in a battle. Nevertheless, and probably no surprise to you by now, he continued to lead his men from the front through the battle. The ever-victorious army's last battle was the bloody fall of Changshu on the 11th of May 1864. In fairness, that storming was overwhelmingly Lai Chongshang's much larger imperial army, who actually lost 15,000 men in the assault. Nevertheless, the victory spelt the death knell for the Taiping Rebellion. Their capital at Nanjing fell to the imperial forces 2 months later. Job done, the ever-victorious army was disbanded. The imperial commander, Lai Chongshang, despite their previous falling out, wrote of Gordon and the role of the EVA in glowing terms, and based upon that letter, the imperial government conferred the rank of Taitu, sort of like a provincial commander-in-chief, on Gordon, and also awarded him the Imperial Yellow Riding Jacket, a highly prestigious honour in China at the time, and one rarely given to foreigners. This time, unlike the silver taels, Charles Gordon accepted. Photographed in his Chinese robes, the British press, which had been following his exploits with the ever-victorious army, now nicknamed him Chinese Gordon. He returned home to a hero's welcome, along with the rank of Brevet Lieutenant Colonel, and was made a commander of the Order of the Bath. Whilst his exploits in exotic, faraway China made him a darling of the British public, it did him no favours in the Victorian British Army. Indeed, for the next 2 decades until his death, despite his success with the ever-victorious army, he was never to hold command of a British fighting unit. In September 1865, he was appointed Commanding Royal Engineer at Gravesend, overseeing the construction of the Lower Thames forts at Gravesend and Tilbury. He also threw himself into local philanthropic projects, several of which continued using money from his estate until the 1930s. In 1872, he was sent to inspect the British military cemeteries in the Crimea. It was whilst passing through Constantinople that he met the Egyptian Prime Minister. Now, Egypt at this time was still nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, but pretty much doing its own thing, including building its own empire in Sudan. The following year, when another Englishman, Samuel Baker, resigned as governor of Sudan's Equatoria province, the Egyptian government asked London if Charles Gordon was available. London was only too happy to oblige. For Charles Gordon, a new adventure beckoned, and Chinese Gordon would soon become Gordon of Khartoum. If you love learning about the people and events that made Britain such an incredible country, not just the battles but the wider events through the centuries, then you might enjoy my free weekly newsletter. This week, for instance, I was looking at the Dutch raid on the Medway in 1667, possibly the Royal Navy's darkest chapter. Start getting your copy by clicking on the link in the description, and let's keep sharing those amazing forgotten stories from British history.